So folks, I don't have much more to tell you about this topic of factoring out the greatest common factor, and yet it's actually a very challenging topic for a lot of students. The reason why is because a lot of times in math you're learning something new, and this technique of factoring out the greatest common factor is something that you have to do in the middle of working with these new, perhaps unfamiliar expressions. And so I'm going to ask you to practice that here, where some of these objects you may be less familiar with or less comfortable with, and some of them I actually expect you to have no idea what these objects are. And yet, I still want us to practice this procedure of factoring out the greatest common factor in this foreign environment. So let's look at this first expression here. Notice this is considered a binomial because it has two terms, and our goal is to begin factoring it, and so we will do so by factoring out the greatest common factor. And what I see is that both terms share this common factor of the square root of xy. So what I can do is I can factor out that common factor, square root of xy, and that's going to leave me with the natural log of z minus 3. And you should confirm that if you were to distribute this square root term over both terms in this binomial, if you were to distribute this square root factor over both terms in this binomial, you would get back to the line above it, and you should check that. So folks, I'd like you to try this one on your own. Pause the video and make sure you actually try it. So what you should have found is that in this case, the greatest common factor, notice both terms here share this factor right here, e to the y squared. And so what can we do? We can go ahead and rewrite this as e to the y squared times the cube root of x plus 1. And you should verify that if you were to distribute this e to the y squared factor over both terms in this binomial, that you'd be back to the line above it. Okay, so where does this come into play in this class? Well, one of the things we're going to be working with is a lot of trigonometry, and so we will need to have this technique of factoring out the greatest common factor. This is something we will do very often in this course, and you may have never tried this before. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to identify the factors that both of these terms share in common. Notice both terms share a common factor of 3. They also both share a common factor of the sine of theta. And at this point in the course, we've only just introduced, or maybe we haven't even yet, introduced these sine and cosine expressions. Nonetheless, they represent particular ratios, so that means they represent numbers, and we can factor them out the way we factor out all other real numbers. So in this case, the common factor, let's go ahead and write that, and I probably should have done that here as well, but I'm going to say that the greatest common factor for this is 3 sine of theta. So we're going to write this as 3 sine of theta times the cosine of theta minus 1. And you should confirm that if you were to distribute this 3 sine of theta back to both terms, we get the line above it. Great. So again, you may not be comfortable working with sines and cosines yet, but that has nothing to do with the idea of factoring out the greatest common factor. What I'd like you to do is pause the video. I'm not going to show you the answer to this one, so pause the video and I'll see you in a moment. So folks, well, many of you have worked with these expressions up here, these expressions here, and maybe you're even comfortable with your sine and cosine expressions. My hope is that none of you have worked with these derivative functions, at least this way. None of you have worked with these integral expressions here. And nonetheless, I'm going to ask you to go ahead and try to factor out the greatest common factor. Let's give it a shot. Here I identify that both of these terms, this is some messy math expression, and hopefully, actually my goal is that you don't understand this. And yet, you can still recognize that this could be thought of as a sum of two terms. Take a look at that. We've got a sum, and then we've got two terms. And hopefully you recognize then also that both terms share a common factor. Both terms have this d dx of f of x. What that actually represents is something you'll learn in other courses, but I still want you to identify that those are common factors. And so what can I do? Well, I can factor out that common factor, d dx of f of x from both of those terms, and when I do so, what I'm left with is just g of x plus h of x. So I'd like you to confirm that if you were to distribute, whatever this thing is, if you were to distribute it back through, notice you get the line above it. Okay, so lastly, folks, I will let you try this one here. And again, I'm not asking you to make sense of the objects that you're working with. Instead, what I'm asking you to make sense of is how do we factor out the greatest common factor? So give that a shot. And although I won't show you the answer yet, I'd like you to go ahead and try it. Okay, so folks, the last thing I want you to do is just jot down, I think this is important to do. I won't always model this for you, but I think it's an important thing to do. Whenever you do a math assignment, ask yourself, what is something that you learned while working this math assignment? Okay. All right, folks, that brings us to the end of the video. I appreciate your attention. I will go ahead and point out that I'm about to put a hyperlink right here so that you can find the answers to some of the U-Try problems that I did not go through. Sometimes I will do that, sometimes I won't. All right, we'll see you in class. Take care.